Okay.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. This is our last event this academic year. We hit June. So today we have a pleasure of hosting Roy Levy from Tel Aviv, who is going to present this paper, News Consumption on Social Media, Evidence from Article Level Slant. This is a joint work with many co-authors, and we go as usual 1 hour, including questions. So please unmute yourself if you have any questions. The talk is recorded, but after we finish after 1 hour, we are going to stay for a few minutes, say a few goodbyes, maybe discuss further questions, and wish each other great summer. So let's go. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is joint work with Luca Bergeri and Zara Eichmeyer at Bocconi, Marcus Mobius, who's at Microsoft Research, and Jacob Steinherd and Richie Zong, who are in Berkeley Statistics. So a common concern that I'm sure everyone here has heard about is that news consumption on social media tends to be like-minded, and as a result, polarization goes up. Now, why do people consume like-minded news? This could be because of the network structure. People have like-minded friends who share like-minded pieces. It could be because of the algorithm that shows people what they tend to agree with. And it could also be because people can easily customize their newsfeed. So this argument is quite common. It's prevalent. You read about it in the popular press. But what people outside of media economics maybe don't know is that there's actually limited evidence for this phenomenon. Selective exposure has been called a myth, and there's even papers saying that there's an echo chamber about echo chambers. Previous papers have found that, if anything, there's only limited evidence for like-minded news consumption and segregation on social media. What we argue in this paper is that so far the literature has suffered from a massive measurement problem. There's a mismatch between the level at which political slant is typically measured, that is the outlet level. Until recently, most studies measure the slant of outlets. So they assumed, for example, that the New York Times is somewhat liberal, and therefore all articles published in the New York Times have the same somewhat liberal slant. But there's a mismatch between this level and the level at which social media news content is curated, which is the article level. Now here I want to clarify that focusing at the outlet was not such a big concern in the past. For example, when people subscribed to one newspaper. If you received one newspaper every day and you read that newspaper cover to cover, or maybe you just read the front page, then that's fine. Anyone reading that newspaper would read the same set of articles, and we could proxy their slant with the average slant of content at that outlet. But today, that's no longer the case. On social media, people often read just one article from a specific outlet. In fact, that's the majority of cases. Often they don't even know the source of the outlet. And most importantly, that article is not chosen randomly. It's a specific article from an outlet. So our hypothesis would be, for example, that liberals won't consume the average New York Times article. They would consume the liberal New York Times articles. And conservatives would consume the relatively conservative New York Times articles. Now, if this hypothesis is correct, that would mean that we've been underestimating the prevalence of echo chambers on social media, because we completely ignored like-minded news consumption within outlets. That's the hypothesis I'll present today. I want to make it clear, we're not the first to think of this limitation. In fact, most previous papers acknowledged this limitation, but they said, look, we would like to measure things at the article level, but there are no known methods for reliably doing so. Well, as everyone here knows, there's been kind of a revolution in text analysis in the last few years, and we believe that today it is possible to measure the slant of articles. So in this paper, we're going to ask, what is the extent of like-minded news consumption on social media, and what mechanisms drive it? Here we go. Generally, the way we'll do this, we're going to collect data on the universe of articles published in the US in 2019 by major news outlets. We're going to assign slant to all of these articles using a large language model, and I'll explain exactly how we do that later. And then our main outcome variable, our main measure will be the difference between the slant consumed by Democrats and Republicans I'll explain later why we think this is a great measure for this paper. And finally, we're going to spend some time toward the end of this talk analyzing mechanisms. What mechanisms contribute to these echo chambers? Or why do we see a greater distance between the slant consumed by Democrats and Republicans? And the general result, which I kind of alluded to until now, is that like-minded news consumption will be substantially higher than we previously thought. We're going to argue that it's relatively high, and we're going to find evidence for several mechanisms contributing to that like-minded news consumption, including the algorithm, sharing patterns of friends, and within outlet news consumption. So let's begin and skip the literature. I'll discuss some of this later throughout the talk. I'm going to present just one or two motivating slides, then discuss our data in detail, explain the design, and show you three sets of results. First, some descriptive statistics on the production of slant, then our main outcome, the extent of like-minded news consumption on social media, and finally, the mechanisms. Feel free to stop me at any time. Let's make this interactive. I'm happy to answer questions throughout the talk.
Can I, because you've already had a slide with empirical approach,
Yes.
And you mentioned social media, and I noticed there is no social media there, I think. So if you go back one slide or two slides.
Yes.
Here, empirical approach, you mentioned social media a few times, but this is a study on articles. Do you use data on sharing?
You mean sharing articles on social media?
Yeah, because you mentioned social media as this is a measure of some exposure. Is that part of the picture?
That's a great question. Our main outcome is going to be clicks. That is, we're going to define that as consumption. However, I'm going to show you something toward the end of this talk on sharing behavior that I think you'll find interesting. So we'll say something about that. But the thing we care about most is what articles people visit. Okay, so a quick motivating slide. Why should we care about social media? Well, the reason is pretty simple. Social media today has become a central and maybe even the central source for news. This is the share of people who say they used each medium to consume as a source of news in the past week. You see that social media has surpassed every single alternative in 2025, including television and online news sites. Now, these are all close. I don't care about this difference, but the fact that social media is among the top three and maybe the number one source for news today makes it quite important to understand exactly what news people are exposed to on social media and whether they are indeed in echo chambers. One thing you should also notice in this figure is the trends. Online news sites used to be an important source of social media as well as news, as well as TV. Both of these are declining. I think for TV, everyone knew this. For online news sites, that's less obvious, while social media increased and has stabilized in the last few years. So if these trends continue, social media will become probably the most important source of news. Okay, so in terms of data, what do we need? We need, first of all, the actual content. We're going to need the content in order to classify the slant of an article. And second, we need consumption patterns. So let's discuss these one at a time. First of all, in terms of content, we're going to look at almost all articles published online by the top 100 US outlets in 2019. We focus on 100 outlets as an arbitrary number. We could have done 50 or 200, but at some point it made sense to stop. Also, 100 outlets already covers the vast majority of news consumption, so we felt that 100 was enough. Now, processing this data was quite challenging. We scraped the articles from the outlet's website, but even after you scrape it, the articles are not clean text. They include, ads, related links, captions. So we spent quite a lot of time cleaning the articles. It's the least interesting part of the project, so I won't discuss it. But if anyone is interested, I'm happy to discuss it offline, or you can see more on the paper. Basically, we have a dedicated library and a large language model, and eventually we have almost 3.5 million cleaned articles. Then the next step is focusing on hard news. Hard news is typically defined as news that appears in the first section of the newspaper. Think of politics, foreign affairs. It's not, sports, weather, entertainment. Why focus on hard news? A, that's the news we typically care about in terms of affecting high stakes outcomes. And B, more importantly, that's the news for which you can define slant. You can't really just say whether, an article showing the score of yesterday's basketball game is liberal or conservative. That's almost meaningless. But for hard news articles, there's often a way to define slant. So we're going to focus on these articles. Those are about 1 million articles in total. Next, we turn to consumption. For consumption, we're going to focus on Facebook. Now, I often get this question, who cares about Facebook? It's not trendy, it's old, and it's a fair question. But here's an important quote from Pew. When it comes to where Americans regularly get news on social media, Facebook outpaces all other social media sites. Let me show you some data. This is the share of Americans getting news on different platforms. This is 2015, 2023. As a reminder, our data is 2019, so it's somewhere in between. And you can see that, Instagram is going up, TikTok is going up, but they're still way behind Facebook. So Facebook is still the most important social media platform, both in number of users and as a source of news. Maybe the one exception is YouTube, but I typically don't define that as social media. What we're going to analyze is social science 1 data. This is a data set that Facebook created that's at the URL level. So each observation is an interaction of a URL and demographics. And we can see for each URL how often this URL was viewed, clicked, and shared on Facebook. And we can see this by demographics. So for example, we can see whether a specific New York Times article was clicked, or how often a specific New York Times article was clicked by conservatives, and how often this article was clicked by liberals. So this is almost the ideal data set. The main benefit is obvious. This is the near universe of data, all Americans, which is amazing. However, there are a few downsides, and I want to be upfront about them. First of all, Facebook adds differential privacy to this data. So it's not the actual number, it's the number plus minus some noise. That won't be a problem for us because we're going to look at aggregate data. We're going to calculate the slant of each article, but then look at the average slant of news consumed by Democrats. So that noise just evens out. It does mean that I can't tell you anything about specific articles. And even for journalists that are not very popular, I can't say much. So that's kind of one downside. It only includes data articles shared at least 100 times. We conduct some robustness tests, and this does not affect the results dramatically, or substantially, but it's still good to note this limitation. And finally, the third limitation is that they have a non-intuitive measure of political affinity. They measure ideology using the pages individuals follow on the platform. So for example, if you follow, Joe Biden and not Donald Trump, you're more likely to be predicted as a liberal user. Now, they're basing this on previous academic studies. So this is done very rigorously and carefully. And it's been shown that this measure actually predicts self-reported partisan ideology. So that's good. Still, this measure is not ideal. One, it does not cover all users. If a Facebook user doesn't follow any relevant pages, they cannot determine that user's ideology. Second, it's how to interpret this measure. And third, there could be some limited circularity. They do use some news outlets, a relatively small subset of the news outlets, to also affect the ideology measure. To deal with these issues, we do two things. The first thing we do is we map this measure of ideology into a measure of the share of registered Democrats and Republicans. This requires some assumptions. We're going to look at a previous paper that had data on both a similar measure to this one and whether someone is a registered Democrat and Republican to do this mapping. This mapping means that we, A, have more interpretable results. Everyone knows what it means to be a registered Democrat, but we don't know what it means to have a liberal political affinity. And the second thing this deals with is the users that are not covered. Well, now we're going to also predict the party registration of the users that do not have a political affinity score. Notice that this mechanically is going to decrease the gap between Democrats and Republicans. We're going to predict this because all of these users, we don't know anything else about them. So they're all going to be predicted to have the kind of Some of them will be predicted to be Democrats and some Republicans, but they all have the same slant. So this will mechanically decrease the extent of like-minded news consumption, but that works against us. So we prefer being conservative, making these conservative assumptions, since they work against kind of our hypothesis. The second thing we'll do is we'll introduce an alternative data set that doesn't suffer from any of these problems. The alternative data set is a data set by Luth. This company has a panel of users, and they can see their browsing behavior. So here we can see each website someone visits, regardless if it's been shared 100 times or not. We see how they reached that website, whether they reached it through Facebook, which is what we care about, and they see the actual party registration for many users. So in a sense, this data set is better in many aspects, but it has one important downside, which is external validity. This is a sample of 5,000 users that are not nationally representative, while the Facebook data is for all Americans. The good news, and I'll say this in advance, we have very similar results when using both data sets. So one has very high external validity, but suffers from issues in measuring ideology. The other has kind of much finer, more precise data, but is not representative. Both reach the same results, so we find that reassuring.
Roy, sorry, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I had a question. Unfortunately, it's from a couple of slides before with,
That's fine.
You were talking about news where people get their news from, the importance of social media, which obviously is super convincing. But I did have a question with regards first the URLs. So the URLs you're using, I suppose you're matching them to traditional news outlet sites. Do you get a sense of news relevant content that does not come from newspapers at all, right? Because
yes.
at the end of there's also like a side comment to that, is that there's something slightly contradictory in here, which is like, actually it's not a question of who is making the information, but how the distribution's actually operating, right? Which is a little bit different. If overall people are still predominantly getting newsworthy contents from newspapers, it's just that it's not from the paper, but from social media. It's a slightly different story, right? It's just, again, a story where actually traditional newspapers have won the battle against TV. They're just distributing differently. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, totally. So two great questions. First of all, in terms of our data, you're right. It's online outlets. So it's not just traditional newspapers. We have here things like Breitbart or BuzzFeed, but it's still news sites. We don't have here, an influencer.
Yeah, exactly. That was my question.
Kind of what your friend says about yesterday's news. That we don't have.
Not even influencers? Like big influencers, no?
No. And that's a limitation. And I think we need more studies on that. I've seen a couple, but I think that's still kind of a literature that has to be explored. So there I completely agree. I still think, this is a lot of content. So people see this in their feed, but it's not everything they see. They could see things from groups, from friends, from family, from influencers, and that's not here. The second question was, what does it matter, right? If they get the New York Times on Facebook or on NewYorkTimes.com, does this even matter? And I think actually this paper, so I'm glad you asked that. This paper shows that this does matter, because what we're going to see is that when they get content from Facebook, they get specific New York Times articles. They no longer get the articles that the editor chose. They get the New York Times article that the algorithm and that their friends chose for them. And there's also going to be a specific subset that's quite different. I don't have this in the slides, but this is kind of a new result that we still haven't finalized. We're also going to do this comparison, actually comparing NewYorkTimes.com to Facebook. And what we find is that when you look at the homepage, there's much less like-minded news consumption. But this is still preliminary, so these results might change. It's kind of the last thing we're working on. But when people visit an article through NewYorkTimes.com, liberals and conservatives visit articles that are generally somewhat similar, while when they visit a New York Times article on Facebook, they visit quite different articles.
Okay, thank you.
So I think even though the link is the same, the context does matter. And I'll say one last thing. Often on social media, they just see the headline and some comments from their friends. They don't actually read the article, but that's a different story. Thanks.
I also have a question about those Facebook accounts that you follow or check. Are these real people or are these bots? Because there was a time when this was a concern. someone is a bot
Yeah.
is following.
So this is Facebook's data, the social science one data, and therefore I'm pretty confident that they do a good job. And also, they only assign ideology to users who follow pages, and bots are less likely to follow pages. And finally, I think bots were a much bigger problem in Twitter. On Facebook, it's a bit more difficult to maintain a bot. Notice that if this bot exists but doesn't visit any news sites, it's not an issue. But so it has to be like a bot that actually logs into Facebook, visits this article, but not that article. So I don't think bots are likely to drive our results. And then we also have the Luth data, which doesn't have any bots. It's actual real users.
Yeah, so that's reassuring. But apart from bots, also international accounts.
Oh, great question. I didn't mention this. The social science one data, you can also pick the year. So we only focus on US users. And we can theoretically do a similar exercise for the UK or Canada or whatever, but we're focusing on the US. Okay, so we have the data. Now we need to determine the slant of articles. Right? That's the main purpose here. We're going to do this in 3 steps. First, we're going to label the slant of a subset of articles using experts. Then we'll predict the slant of all articles using large language models. And finally, we'll run some validation exercises. So why do we need experts? For 2 reasons. First, determining the slant of an article is a challenging task even for a large language model, so we wanted to train the model. The second is that even for human beings, a slant is not obvious. So when you read an article today about tariffs in 2019, if you're not someone who actually follows the news or is interested in the news, you might not remember what is the slant of that article. Wait, was Trump pro-tariff? Was Trump anti-tariff at that point? What did the Democrats say? So previous papers, what they have done is they hired M-Turkers or people on Prolific and asked them, what is the rating of specific articles or paragraphs? But they found pretty low agreement rates. And I think they found low agreement rates because it's a hard task for just someone who happens to be an M-Turk. We have a different approach. We decided to hire 2 freelance raters. These are people who have a relevant graduate degree, who we screened and interviewed. And therefore, we're going to call them experts, but you can just think of these as kind of people who take the task seriously and have the relevant experience and qualification. And what they're going to do is they're going to review about 4,000 articles from a universe of articles. We're going to stratify the articles by the week of the year. So each time they see several articles from the same week, giving them some internal comparison, which makes the task a little bit easier. And we're going to define slant on a scale from -3, which is very left-leaning, to +3, which is very right-leaning. And we're going to use in this project a holistic definition of slant. So we tell them slant includes both the language, any explicit political position of the article, say an endorsement, and the issues covered in the article. To make sure that kind of the gold labels, the classification of these experts is really of high quality, we also hired a research assistant for this specific task and asked the research assistant to review all the cases where the 2 readers disagreed about the direction of the slant. One reader said the article is conservative, the other said it's liberal. Fortunately, that's pretty rare. It happens only 6% of the times, so that's already kind of reassuring, but it still happens. It could be because one reader was not paying attention for a minute, or because this article has both conservative and liberal passages. So in those cases, the RA reads the article carefully, explains the disagreement, and then replaces one of the labels with his own label for that specific article. Overall, we do a pretty good job with the raters. We find that the correlation between the labels is about 0.72, and the median and model difference is 0. Then the next thing we do is we take these labels to predict the slant of all articles. Now, when we started this project over 5 years ago, a bit embarrassing, then we had to I had to explain what I mean when we kind of use these large models to predict slant. Since then, everyone is using large language models. So fortunately, I don't have to spend a lot of time on this. So I won't explain why we need large language models. I will explain 2 things that are less trivial. First of all, we fine-tune the models. So fine-tuning the models basically means providing the models with the correct answers and to specific prompts, and then adjusting the model weights accordingly. In this task, that makes a difference. It improves the model's precision substantially, and I think that's a general takeaway, that if you're working on a difficult task with an LLM, fine-tuning it can help. I will say that the models have improved. When we started this working with, I don't know, GPT 3.5 or Roberta, like fine-tuning was critical. Today, we could have managed, without just using the model out of the box, but the results would have been substantially noisier. So the models are getting better at doing this on their own, but they still need the fine-tuning. The second thing we do, and this is kind of following requests from the referees, but I think these are good requests, is we're now transitioning from GPT to an open source model. The main benefit here, and this is going to be actually the first time that I show the results from the open source model, so hopefully there are no mistakes in these slides, and I should say these results are almost complete. They're not complete yet, so some numbers are going to change a bit in the next version. Running this takes time, but the main benefit of the open source model is it means that once this article is published, we will not only share, here are 1 million, here's the database, 1 million articles and 1 million values of slant. We will actually share a model that anyone can run on their own computer, assuming it's strong enough, but it doesn't have to be like a supercomputer. Anyone can run on their own computer, provide an article, and ask what is the slant. So that's a nice feature of having an open source model. Once this is complete, we're almost there. Okay, so
can I ask about this a second? So yes, I understand exactly what the benefit of the open source model is, which is that anybody can go and check themselves what you're getting.
Yeah.
I mean, if they have the data, but I mean, so I wonder how effective this model is compared to ChatGPT or Claude, so how good it is. Because I can see how one would argue that at the end of the day, if you show how you trained it, not what the model does, but the prompt you gave it, and the data, I personally would be satisfied that you're using the state-of-the-art stuff. I know this changes every 6 months, but it's what it is. Rather than something that's open source, which, given the amount of money that training these models takes, something that's open source might actually be, I don't know, maybe, you know where I'm going with this.
Yes, completely. So I think I agree with that trade-off. Here's what I can say. We used GPT 4.0, which is slightly older than Gemma 3, and the performance is similar. That's why we chose this model. We didn't want to sacrifice performance. The performance of these two is very similar. However, it's possible that if we used now GPT 5.5, we could have had better performance and something that's not replicable. Also, when fine-tuning the model, we fine-tune it in a way that makes it kind of computationally efficient, and makes the model smaller. This means that it's easier to replicate, but again, it might mean that we give up a tiny bit of precision. And then I don't think there's a correct answer. Some people will prefer something that's completely replicable, and some people will prefer, the best performance, even if it means that it's hard to replicate. I think since we're not giving up a lot of performance, then I think having the open source is nice, but I don't have I don't think there's a correct answer. And I see someone hold.
Hi. Sorry, just a quick question on this slide. So I was wondering how strict and necessary it is to fine-tune the model versus maybe just providing some, few examples, like some kind of, some kind of a few shot type of, exercise. Have you kind of experimented with that?
No, we did not. We only took the two extreme examples, zero shot and fine-tuning. With zero shot and fine-tuning, I don't want to say the exact numbers, but I think if I remember correctly, performance measured compared to a test set that we left out improves by about a quarter. So it's no longer a huge difference. It used to be a huge difference, but it's still pretty substantial. Now, whether we could achieve most of that with a few shots, maybe. I'm not sure. But here's another advantage of an open source model, right? But someone can check. But maybe that's no longer necessary. Maybe 10 articles would have been enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
I guess for us, now that we already have the labels, there's no reason not to use them. But it's important for future work, whether you actually need, if you do this now for 2025 and things have changed completely, whether you actually need to get all of these labels or whether 20 is enough. That's a great question. Great. So, Arushi, yeah, hi.
Hi, I was also wondering if you have the results without the fine tuning. There might be a case of fine tuning actually makes the model perform worse.
No, that we did check. Fine tuning helps. It definitely helps. I don't remember if that's in the paper, but like we mentioned earlier, it improves it does make a big difference. So for sure fine tuning helps, but maybe we don't need so many articles. That could be the case. And maybe we don't even need to completely fine tune and change the weights. Maybe it's enough to just provide a few prompts. I don't know. Okay, so anytime you have a new measure, like in this case, we want to make sure that this measure works well, especially for something that we couldn't measure properly in the past. So we're going to use both internal and external validation. For internal validation, it's pretty simple. We have a training set that we use to fine-tune the model and a validation set that we left out. And then we compare the model's predictions to the validation set. And things look generally pretty good. The experts and the model agree on the slant direction in 92% of cases. The difference is about 0.4, which is 5% of the length of our scale. And the correlation is relatively high. For external validation, we're going to use existing data sets of slant. Now, remember that I mentioned previously that most data sets don't do this at the article level. So we're going to take an outlet level measure and compare that measure to what we created. So basically, we'll take all of the articles for which we have slant in a specific outlet, take the average, and compare that average to previous estimates of the slant of outlets. And here are the results. We're going to use the Bakshi et al. Measure because it's pretty common in the literature, but we could have used other measures. And you see a very strong correlation between the slant that Bakshi et al. Assigned to an outlet and the average slant of all articles we assign to that outlet. So notice, for example, we both agree that New York Times is more liberal than Fox News. But what's more interesting is that this masks out of heterogeneity in our data. In our data, New York Times and Fox News aren't just one point, they're a distribution. And here you can see that distribution. You see that on average, New York Times is more liberal than Fox News. We knew that from previous papers. But what maybe we did not know is that both New York Times and Fox News have many articles that are quite moderate. And even Fox News has some articles that are slightly liberal. Remember, this is foxnews.com, not Fox News, the television channel. They're similar, but they're not the same. And within the New York Times, some articles are very liberal, but some are only moderately liberal, and there are almost no articles that are very conservative. So this distribution is something that we did not have before this paper. We can do a similar exercise with journalists. The data is noisier, but we still find positive correlation between our measures and previous measures. And finally, we can even check this with a previous measure at the article level. So Ad Fontes is an organization that kind of provides reports on the slant of outlets, and they actually manually review articles. And there's a few hundred articles that exist in their data and our data. And we can look at the correlation in slant. And we again find a very strong correlation, which we find encouraging because here we have a few hundred articles that were manually assigned, while for us, these articles were automatically assigned along with 1 million additional articles by our classification system. So we're able to do this at scale. Once we do this at scale, we can look at the consumption of all Democrats and all Republicans. Great. Finally, this is more of an intuition and less of a validation. We can look at which words are associated or most predictive of article level slant. Notice it does not mean that the model necessarily uses these words. It's just the words that are most predictive of slant. We see that conservative articles tend to discuss AOC, Hillary Clinton, illegal immigrants, socialism, while more liberal articles tend to discuss identity issues, whether it's women, LGBTQ, pride, Black, and so forth. Excellent. So we have the data, we have the predictions, now we can start seeing the results. Let's begin at just what slant is
Sorry,
produced.
before we go there, can I have a
Yes.
short question? I'm not sure if this is not an embarrassing question. So when these articles were given either
I
to a
should,
few
yeah, I
months
should have
or
highlighted that. It's all 2019.
right, no, but I meant about the labels that are there. So there's a title, there's I think, but people or those assessors, be it computers or they don't know whether these are Fox News and stuff. This is all sort of blind.
Oh, I see. You mean the laters? You mean
The source, for example. So
yeah.
does the
So
assessor know it's a Fox News article?
that's a good question. So we don't explicitly tell them, but sometimes they could have found out. The article could have said, as the New York Times previously reported, for example.
Right.
And now, this is also one thing we've been debating for a while. One change we made in our model in the very last version is we actually removed, whenever it says as previously reported in the New York Times, it now says as previously reported in outlet without saying which one. So we wanted the outlet to not explicitly use the we wanted the model to not explicitly use the outlet information. It can still pick it up based on the style of the writing and so
Exactly.
forth.
So this is what I wanted to, because once you provided this words, this suggests there's some kind of coding, right? If they say AOC, that's code that's a there's a code there. And so this raises a question about what the limits of text-based analysis if it's applied sort of on the word level. Because one could imagine you take articles, you translate them into neutral language to focus on the content behind it. So there's a form and there's a content. And this can be sort of combined together into
Yes.
form a label. And to me, that would matter whether
Yes.
this is a cultural coded message versus a proper content that I define as right wing or left wing or whatever.
I completely agree. So in another project that's in much earlier stages, we're attempting to do something similar. We want to try to kind of decompose slant. In this project, since this is kind of the first attempt to measure the slant of articles, we're intentionally holistic. We include both content and form because both have been shown to be important in the literature, right? Like there's this paper showing that it does matter whether you say illegal immigrants or just say immigrants who are currently undocumented. Like those things actually matter. So we care about form, but obviously content matters as well. And here we can't disentangle them. But in future work, we're hoping to kind of say which of these contributes more to slant. Completely agree. Okay, first let's see some data. So this is the 1 million articles, and this may or may not surprise you. Many of the articles are quite moderate. We don't see these concerns that articles are all extremely liberal or extremely conservative. There's a big chunk of moderate articles. Let's try to understand this a bit more. We can look at this by the type of article. We can compare, here we go, opinion pieces, here we go. Opinion pieces to non-opinion pieces. For non-opinion articles, the more moderate articles, but still some liberal and conservative ones. For opinion articles, we see this by model distribution, where articles tend to be either liberal or conservative, but there's like a missing middle. This has often been hypothesized, right? There's like no one arguing strongly for moderate positions in opinion pieces today in the American media environment, which also I think is important. We can also look at this by location. Here the results are less surprising. International news tends to be, neutral. An article about Ebola in Uganda would not be considered liberal or conservative. That's not surprising, but still kind of is sensible. Local news tends to have more liberal and conservative pieces, but still many neutral ones, while national news tends to be the most politicized. Again, not surprising, but good to know. Finally,
Can I ask a question here? So,
yes.
in a sort of very stylized way, you would imagine that non-opinion article would entirely be at the 0 point, right? In a way, these are facts, and if facts are facts, and yeah, whatever. But how do we interpret? I think there is a liberal slant here overall, uh, are we saying that basically media tends to report facts that support liberal positions? They're still facts, but they support liberal positions. Say, let me give an example. Immigration is good.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a fact, maybe, but it's certainly not. So, is that what we're seeing, or do you have other
So it again,
explanations? Because clearly, for international news, wherein I guess the stakes are lower for the vast majority of people, the representation then converges to a very symmetric distribution, very close to zero,
that's right.
right?
That's right. So I think it's kind of similar to the previous question. I think it's both. I think it's the facts they discuss, and here's maybe a great example. Let's see which facts are discussed by which articles. And here you can see that Democratic scandals are discussed much more often by conservative articles and Republican scandals by liberal articles. But you also see some other things. The environment, unsurprisingly, appears more often in liberal articles, while conflict, war, and peace in conservative articles. So that's one, there's fact. But it could also be the style we mentioned earlier. Do they write death tax or estate tax as an example, right? That would also be picked up even if it's the same fact but described differently. So those would be, I think, the two things within the non-opinion pieces. And those are kind of the things we described when explaining this exercise to the raters. And we provided the same prompt later to the model.
Okay.
Great. I'll go through these next slides relatively quickly just to make sure we have time for all the results. The next thing we do is a variance decomposition exercise. So remember, our hypothesis in this paper is that we should also care about variation within outlets. But then there's an open question, does this variation actually matter in terms of how much variation is there within outlets? So we're going to try to decompose how much of the variation in slant is within outlets versus across outlets. The two extreme scenarios is that, one scenario is that everything is explained by outlets and within outlet there's no variation. The other extreme scenario is that all outlets are on average the same, but within each outlet there's a wide distribution of slant. So we do kind of a classic variance decomposition. We do have to account for measurement error because we have noisy predictions. Once we take that into account, and here I'm going to skip the calculation, but it's in the paper, we find that about 1/3 of the variation in slant is explained by outlets, that is across outlets, and 2/3 is within outlets. The takeaway here is that focusing on the outlet level means we ignored most of the variation in slant in the literature. And therefore, I think at least potentially this could be meaningful. When there's so much variation within outlets, then we should also look at what's going on within outlets. Okay, great. Now let me show you the results in terms of our bigger question, what are people actually consuming? So our main measure is going to be a very simple measure of like-minded news consumption or polarization news consumption. We'll look at the average slant of news articles clicks on Facebook by registered Republicans and by registered Democrats and just take the difference. Now, I want to highlight that there's an alternative measure used in the literature often, which is segregation. Segregation basically measures whether liberals and conservatives are consuming the same thing. And this measure actually has been recently expanded to the article level by a great paper that's part of the Facebook 2020 project. But in our opinion, while segregation is important, it's not what we care about when discussing polarization. I'll provide an example to clarify this. Suppose Democrats tend to read about, dangerous storms in California, and Republicans read about storms in Texas. That would be considered high segregation because they're reading different stories. However, both of these articles will probably be considered neutral, and in terms of slant, there will be zero difference. And this is what we care about. We don't necessarily, here's an even more extreme example. Suppose a Democrat reads an AP article that was published in LA Times, and a conservative reads the same AP article published in the Houston Chronicle. Again, that could be considered to have high segregation. It's different articles, but the content is the same. So why should we care about that? So what we're going to do here is what we care about is are liberals consuming more liberal pieces? That's what we think matters. If liberals keep reading more liberal pieces than conservatives, we could argue that there is some degree of echo chambers. If they're just reading different articles, but in the end are exposed to the same slant, that's less of a concern. So this is a harder test, but we think it's the one that really matters. Great. So here's the main result. It's less exciting. There's no figure for this specific, but don't worry. I'll have some more exciting figures coming up. The difference in slant is about 0.84. So this is just as a reminder, we have a 7-point scale. So this is a 1-point difference in this 7-point scale, which in practice is a 6-point scale because we almost never assign the extremes. This would have been even bigger, but we prefer the more conservative measure of party registration. Now some magnitudes. Is this really big? One, it's about 85% of a standard deviation in all our data. So that already sounds quite big. Democrats consume articles that are 0.85 standard deviations more liberal. Second, it's similar to the distance between the Washington Post and Washington Times. These are like two classic examples of liberal and conservative outlets. So this is like a liberal reading on average, the news consumed on the Post and the conservative on the Times. This is similar to the difference between Nicholas Kristof and David Brooks, kind of a liberal writer and a moderately conservative writer, or difference in the tweets by Chuck Schumer and Marco Rubio. We can also compare this to demographics. This is 4.5 times the difference between our youngest cohort, which is the most liberal one, and 55 to 64-year-olds, which are more the cohort that consumes the most conservative news. And it's about 5 times the difference in the gender gap in terms of consuming news of different ideology. We run a bunch of robustness checks that I'll skip. The only one I'll mention is that we get a very similar result when we use the Luth dataset. Yes, question?
A quick question. I was wondering how much of this distance is, because this is all unconditional distance between the two types of voters, right? I was wondering if you could look into like the distance, taking into account that they are actually looking into different outlets as well. So
yes,
if we look into their clicks onto the same outlet, are they still picking different types of slants?
That's my favorite type of question because it leads me to the next slide. So thank you so much. So this is a natural question. Right? Okay, well, you found a lot of polarization or like-minded news consumption, but how is that related to this within outlet consumption you discussed so far? So that's exactly what I want to discuss next. I'm going to discuss 3 or 4 mechanisms. I'm just saying 3 or 4 because I'm not sure I have time for the last one. First of all, is this driven, just exactly like you asked, is this driven by within outlet news consumption? Second, how much of this is due to the feed versus what I select within the feed? And third, how much of this relates to the sharing behavior that I was asked about previously? If we have time, we'll also discuss the social network. So let's begin with within outlet news consumption. Here you can see the slant of the news consumed by liberals on USA Today. Remember, these are Facebook clicks to usatoday.com, and the same for conservatives. And here you see within USA Today a difference in the articles consumed. Now, obviously, this is an anecdotal example, but we can expand this to 20 outlets. And we see that for almost every outlet, liberals consume more liberal news within that outlet. One way to think about this is there's almost like 2 versions of USA Today. The liberal version is very similar to the articles conservatives consume on the Post. And the conservative version is similar to the articles that liberals read in the New York Post. Right? It just demonstrates how far these differences could become. So each of these outlets, not each of them, but almost each of them has quite different stories that are read by the liberals who visit this outlet and the conservative who visit this outlet. And going back to the question, we can also quantify this. How will we quantify it? We can calculate our same polarization measure, but this time assume that each outlet has only one measure of slant, the average of all articles in that outlet. And once we do that, we find that and then we can compare these 2 measures, one which is now at the outlet level, because we assume that slant is constant within outlet, and one that's our original measure. And we find that polarization, or the difference between Democrats and Republicans, increased by about 50% when we measure it at the article level. So that kind of answers your question. Selection into outlets is definitely important, but there's also quite a lot of selection within outlets. Thanks. So that's the first kind of mechanism we looked into. The second mechanism, which I find quite interesting because it's also going back to the previous question, unique to social media, is that we can distinguish between exposure and selection. So remember, this data that we use is the social science 1 data, and it has views, clicks, and shares. So far, we focused on clicks. This figure also shows you clicks. Shows you within each outlet, labels click more label articles. But maybe they just choose the more label articles, which is completely fine, or maybe they see in advance the more label articles. So we can recreate this figure, but this time for the feed, which is what I call exposure. And here's the result. And as you can see, when I go through these back and forth, the figures are remarkably similar. In other words, individuals are exposed to like-minded news within outlets. It's not that they just visit different articles of USA Today. They actually see different USA Today stories in their feed. Liberals tend to see the more liberal USA Today articles in their feed compared to conservatives. And here again, we can do a very simple calculation, where we can assume, suppose there was no selective exposure within the feed. If people just clicked what they saw, how much of the polarization, how much of the like-minded news consumption would that explain? Well, the answer is about, sorry, again, this jumped. The answer is 88%. So almost all of the polarization is already explained by the feed. Now, obviously the feed is endogenous. Facebook shows you what they think you're likely to click, which makes a lot of sense. But this kind of creates a problem because it means that it's not only that liberals don't click the conservative articles in New York Times or less likely to click them, they don't see them to begin with. They're often not even aware of their existence. And this, I think, is something we're going to have to deal with as a society when people already see different things in their feed and not only choose to click different things. So that's the second mechanism. The third mechanism I want to discuss is the sharing behavior that I was previously asked about. So we actually see what people share. But the first thing I'll say is, remember that I showed you previously this slide. This slide is the distribution in the news created, the production, just the 1 million articles. And when you see this slide, it's a bit shocking that there could be a full 1 point difference between liberals and conservatives, right? Because most of the articles are neutral. So how can liberals see news that's substantially more liberal than conservatives if articles tend to be moderate? Well, the answer is that this figure shows you which articles are created. They don't show you how often they are circulated on social media. What we can do is we can take this figure and for each article, calculate its probability of being widely circulated. What we're going to do is for each of these points, calculate the likelihood of being shared at least 100 times on Facebook. We could also have done 200, 300 times. The results are even more extreme, but 100 was good enough. This is what the results look like. The more extreme articles are much more likely to get shared on social media. So the distribution of content, so while the distribution of the news produced tends to be moderate, the distribution of news shared widely on social media tends to have much more extreme articles. And this can explain why we see the big difference between liberals and conservatives. Great, since I didn't get questions, I'll have time to discuss the last mechanism. The last mechanism is how much could this be explained by the behavior of your friends? Now here I should say, I think so far I've shown you results that are pretty conclusive. For this mechanism, we do not have the ideal data. I'll be upfront about this. So this is going to rely on much stronger assumptions, but it's still interesting, so we thought it's worth a shot. What we need to know is whether people have liberal or conservative friends, but we don't see that in the social science 1 data. Remember, this data set is at the URL level, not the individual level. And even the Luth data doesn't help us because it's not a social media data, it's data of browsing behavior. However, we do know from previous papers how many liberal, conservative, and moderate friends people have on social media. So we can make some pretty strong assumption and assume that liberals always have this share of friends. So for example, I don't know the exact numbers, but liberals have, 50% liberal friends, 30% moderate, 20% conservatives. And maybe for conservatives, it's, 45, 25, and 30 or whatever. So we can take those numbers And then assume that people see the content shared by their friends with equal probability. Again, a strong assumption. And we assume that all conservatives share the same content, all moderates share the same content, and so do all liberals. Notice that again, these strong assumptions work against us. In practice, it's possible that liberals are more likely to see the content liberal friends, but we don't want to make, we want to make kind of the strong yet conservative assumptions. Then we can calculate what would be my exposure just based on the news shared for my friends. So it's going to be the exercise. First, let's see what news is shared by friends. Well, this won't surprise you, but users share much more liberal content. On average, content that gets the -1 on this in our rating of slant. Conservatives share much more conservative content. You see that the difference is actually much stronger than the difference in clicks. We already knew this. The difference in sharing behavior is bigger compared to the difference in consumption behavior. And then we can use this data to calculate, based on my social network, what content would liberals be exposed to and would conservatives be exposed to, only when holding everything fixed, besides the fact that liberals and conservatives have different friends. Well, once we do that, we find that this explains 60% of the polarization and exposure. Now, I don't think this number is necessarily the exact number because of these assumptions, but what I think we learned from this exercise is that your social network can explain a substantial chunk of the difference in exposure. It's probably not the only explanation, but it is a meaningful explanation. Great, I have exactly enough time to conclude and even take a few questions at the end. So what do we find in this paper? So measuring slant at the outlet level masks a lot of variation. Most of the variation actually occurs within outlets. Once we take into account variation within outlet, we find substantial difference in the slant of articles consumed by liberals and conservatives. It's 50% greater than estimates based on the outlet level slant. And in my opinion, this could perhaps explain this gap between kind of these deep public concerns and the existing academic evidence that did not find a lot of evidence for echo chambers. We found also some evidence for mechanisms. Some of this happens due to like-minded news consumption within outlet. We find that slanted news is more likely to circulate on social media. And we find that even at the feed level, before looking at clicking or consuming, there's already a large difference in the slant of liberals and conservatives. Finally, we already discussed future work on how slant is constructed. The second thing we were working on, but in very, very early stages, is looking at how slant changes over time. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you very much. We have about 3 minutes or so of the recorded time. So, but before we go to the questions within that slot, and then after we finish the recording, let me officially thanks Roy for the great presentation and for the audience to stick for coming and today, and wish you the great summer. Hopefully, we'll see each other after the summer in the new academic year. Right. Any questions while we are still having a recorded time in the audience? I had a question about the sharing, if I may kick off this. So you mentioned sharing as an important measure, but is there a bit of a possibility, at least, that sharing does not necessarily mean endorsement, and it shouldn't be necessarily perceived as that? It could be, to expose. So look, they are telling us this is ridiculous, phenomena like that on social media.
Yeah. I think that's possible. I think here we use sharing mostly for two things, kind of to see what gets circulated and to kind of see how one social network affects their exposure. However, I think those two things could be affected by what you described, but probably won't change dramatically. However, when we look at actual sharing behavior, I still have my screen shared. We see that in practice, the fact that liberals almost always share liberal content and suggests to me that it's not, sharing content and saying, oh, look how ridiculous this is. Sometimes liberals share very conservative content, but it's very rare. You see these kind of blue bars here. And that's why I think that's less likely to drive our results.
I see. Yeah, great, thanks. Other questions?
Actually, Roy, just following on from that, can you guys see likes because I'm thinking what Max was mentioning. So the ironic share, look at these idiots, what they think, might be controllable by looking at the emojis that the people put there, right? I'm wondering, you probably have that data. I'm just maybe you don't, but that could be done. I had a different question, which maybe we should postpone until we stop the recording because.
Yeah,
Okay,
let's use this. This is
answer the
from
likes
Stop
and
the
then we can
recording.
stop. Yeah, here we go. So I'll just answer the likes. We do have that data, but keep in mind the data is at the article level, at the individual level. So I won't be able to see whether someone shared an article without liking it or vice
Okay.
versa. Yeah.
Okay.